Oniken is a new platformer made in the classic 8-bit style of home computers and consoles of old. When the opening cutscene started and that music kicked in, I was instantly transported back to the late 1980s and could quite easily have been looking at the screen of my trusted Commodore 64 from back then. Such was the nostalgic vibe that the opening evoked in me. However, if the game is going to play the nostalgia card, then it better do a bloody good job of it. Us 30-somethings are very protective of our video game related childhood memories after all. So, how does it do? Well, I'm Glenn for SwitchUp. Thank you to the developer for the review copy, and now, let's find out. In terms of its story, Oniken deploys practically every late 80s or early 90s trope and cliche from games and movies of the time. Set in the year 20XX? Check. A panning shot of a city in flames? Check. A dystopian future involving a machine uprising and the subsequent human resistance? Check. And of course, an inexplicable and completely out of context with the rest of the story ninja protagonist? A huge check. The only thing missing is the loose cannon protagonist having an eye patch. In fact, I'm pretty sure that in its spare time, this game walks around wearing an I Heart the 80s t-shirt. Graphics wise, not only does Oniken use the often seen 8-bit retro style, but it does so whilst seemingly wanting to replicate the hardware limitations of the time too. Although it still does more than an 8-bit machine would have been capable of, with full coloured backgrounds and more detailed sprites. It is not a faux 8-bit style with beautiful light and shadow effects and huge amounts of parallax scrolling either. This has a look that could fit fairly seamlessly in amongst genuine games of the time without looking like an obvious anachronism. The screen also includes a scanline effect in an attempt to authenticate the look further. Cutscenes give a Ninja Gaiden vibe, and I especially love how all of the high-tech equipment in the cutscenes looks terribly out of date, just as any representation of the future looks these days when watching an 80s movie. I thought this was quite a nice touch. Despite limiting itself in terms of its colour palette, Oniken does a good job of using these colours well. Bright oranges, turquoises and purples adorn the background, and there is a decent variety in the level settings too. On some levels, the colour choices come across as a little garish, and perhaps a little less would have been more in these instances, but on the whole, the aesthetic is handled well and cuts a fine balance between paying homage to a great era in the video game industry and falling into insignificance due to the sheer volume of other games that also choose to do this these days. In my opinion, it achieves this by fusing the best of what both consoles and home computers of the time were doing graphically, meaning that whatever your system of choice as a child of that era, Oniken will spark something deep in your memory, and overall, graphics receive 15 out of 20. As you would expect, the audio follows a similar path to the graphics and keeps a retro flavour. Each level has its own theme, and some of these are very catchy. I must admit I found myself humming the level 2 music hours after turning the game off. The sound effects are also very appropriate for the time period that they are emulating. Whilst there is absolutely nothing wrong with the music, far from it, it doesn't quite match the visuals in terms of that nostalgia boost. Although it is very catchy, it doesn't quite capture the simplicity of classic chiptune. Although it's not far off, to be fair, but at the same time, it just cannot match the deep and powerful majesty that was some of the Commodore 64's music. For anyone wanting to know what I mean by that, type in The Last Ninja 2 Commodore 64 music into YouTube and have a listen for yourself. Oniken falls somewhere in between these two classic styles, and the music and audio receives 14 out of 20. The first thing I noticed about Oniken in terms of its gameplay is that the gameplay is equally as reminiscent of the games from the 80s and 90s as the graphics are. This is not a modern styled game with a retro aesthetic. This game could genuinely be a lost relic from that time period. Levels are very much based on pattern memorization. You will learn enemy placement and attack patterns by rote, and doing so will see you go from witnessing the game over screen midway through the first level to completing said level without losing a life within a few tries. You will feel yourself getting better at the game as you play, and this is always a very satisfying experience. Rather than being a one hit per life affair, you have a life bar consisting of around 20 fragments. Obviously, stronger enemies will deplete your bar quicker than weaker enemies, but it's nice being able to take a few hits before losing a life. As you may expect though, falling into a pit is an insta-death, and just to keep with the late 80s theme, hitting an enemy will see you knocked back and a fair bit of the time fall straight into one of the aforementioned pits. I'll be honest, this is one of those frustrating gameplay mechanics that could well have stayed in the 80s as far as I'm concerned. Your weapon of choice is a sword, and your attack has a decent range to it. In fact, the game does a good job of making you feel powerful but entirely vulnerable at the same time. In terms of level design and layout, each level is split into around 3 areas, each of these serving as a checkpoint and usually ending with a boss battle. Should you reach a checkpoint, then you will start from here if you lose a life. However, there are no continues within the game, so losing your final life will see you having to begin the level again from the very beginning. I must interject here though and say that although there aren't continues per se, if you do complete a level, then you can choose to start from this level the next time you play. It's a relatively fair compromise, but it can feel pretty harsh having just 3 lives to complete a level before you have this privilege, especially if you keep dying on the end of level boss and must then traverse back through the level all over again. This is precisely what Oniken is though. As I mentioned earlier, it's pure muscle memory and rote learning all the way. There are so many games of the 80s era that Oniken reminds me of. I could see elements of childhood favourites such as Midnight Resistance, Sly Spy, Ninja Gaiden, Shinobi, Sunsoft's NES classic Batman and Strider, to name but a few. This is in terms of level layout, cutscenes, boss battles, combat and gameplay mechanics. It just seems to have a handy little knack of reminding you every so often, no matter how small, of a game you've played before. Talking of bosses, these are some of the highlights of the game and include battles against fellow ninjas, this one here reminding me of the final battle against the Joker from the aforementioned Batman game, screen-filling robots and cybernetic polar bears. There is also a little variety in the levels with the inclusion of these speedboat levels. Obviously, with such a list of games that Oniken has seemingly taken inspiration from, you could concur that perhaps the gameplay is quite derivative. And while this is an accusation that holds a little weight, by its very nature, it is clearly trying to emulate said games, and it doesn't really bring anything new to the table either, but that's not to say that the gameplay is bad. On the contrary, despite being a little derivative, it feels like finally trying a game that you knew of from back in the day, but never got around to playing. Finally playing it satisfies the curiosity you had without you feeling the need for it to innovate too much. Gameplay gets 14 out of 20. In terms of the controls, Oniken takes an interesting approach by going for an A-X button combination. Pressing A is your jump button and X performs your attack. It's an unusual approach, with most platformers opting for A being jump and B being attack, or B being jump and Y being attack. I must admit, my thumb kept gravitating towards the B and Y buttons, but you do soon get used to it. There is no option to reconfigure the controls though, and this is a little disappointing. The B button is instead used for a berserk attack, which sees you becoming very powerful for a limited time, and it can only be performed once you have picked up a sword power-up. You can also acquire grenades during your quest, and in order to use these, you must press up and X at the same time. There is nothing inherently wrong with this, but it does just feel like an attempt to shoehorn a bit more nostalgia in for days when joypads had less buttons and joysticks 1 or 2 at the most. Nostalgia should never come at the expense of intuitive level design or control layout, and it would have just made far more sense to assign this particular action to the shoulder buttons. Another thing I feel I must mention is that I initially played this game using a Pro controller, and it was very difficult to control. My character would randomly stand up whilst I was ducking, or not jump forward when I was trying to leap onto a ledge. knowing that the D-pad on the Pro controller isn't the best, I tried with the Joy-Cons after and things were much better. The level of control that the split buttoned D-pad allowed for really did help make the game a far more enjoyable experience. Now, I'm not mentioning this as a criticism of the game, I just wanted to make people aware that the Joy-Con looked to be the way to go when playing Oniken, and controls receive 15 out of 20. Oniken costs £8.99 or $9.99 and offers 6 levels for this price. In keeping with everything else about the package, it goes for the higher difficulty extending the playtime route, and although a tough game, it is not as punishingly difficult as some of the games that it has taken inspiration from. The lack of continues is negated by a level select once you've completed a level. However, there is still some frustration to be had if you run out of lives on a level and must begin back at the start of said level rather than at the checkpoint you have just reached. A feeling that is exacerbated if you are on the final boss of that stage. But then, if you are playing this game, then the chances are that you grew up with this exact formula in many of your games at that time, and you probably bought this game just so that you could experience such frustrations again. You little masochist you. Value gets 16 out of 20. To conclude, Oniken is a lovingly crafted representation of what made gaming in the 80s so much fun. Close your eyes and imagine your top 3 side-scrollers from that time, and chances are that Oniken will remind you of at least one of them in some small way whilst playing. This could quite easily have been a game you just discovered on a top NES games you never heard of list. Such is the effort the developers have gone to try and recreate the era, and if you have any nostalgia for that era, this game will have you smiling. Oniken gets a SwitchUp score of 74%. Many thanks for watching, everybody. I actually lost my voice this week and it's just about returning, so apologies if that comes through in the video. I've got a nice cup of honey and lemon on standby as soon as I'm finished here. Please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. We're just about to hit 19,000 at the time of this video, which is absolutely fantastic. A quick thank you to our Patreons, as always, for your continued support, and for everybody else for watching our videos. Take care, and as always, happy gaming.